There are more people following the advice that I've given about how to live overseas and even how to live in numerous different countries overseas while traveling the world. I'm going to share an article with you and share how you can actually do this yourself. I'm Andrew Henderson. This is another edition of Nomad Capitalist. I have the basic looking mug today with my TWG Earl Grey Gentleman Tea. They're not a sponsor, I'm just a fan. And we do this every once in a while where we just talk off the cuff about the real world implications of being a nomad capitalist. And if you have kids, or if you're planning to have kids, you might think, hey, I can't do what this Andrew guy is doing where I'm traveling around the world, living in my different homes, because what are the kids going to do? And for me, I think that the fundamental question you have to ask yourself is, just all things being equal, do you want your kids to go to the schools where you live? A lot of people would say, no, I don't think they learn a lot. I think that they're teaching my kids stuff I don't want them to learn about. I think they're just kind of warehousing the kids. It's not safe for them to go there. I mean, there's physical dangers that I'm worried about. That's a lot of what I would hear about from my friends, namely in the US, but I think in other Western countries as well. A number of people think that the school system just isn't doing its job. And if you look at some of the test scores, I mean, the US came in dead last among developed countries by some metrics. So perhaps some of those parents are onto something. Now, if you agree that your kids perhaps aren't best off in the schools that they're in, and I've had friends that bring your teenage son, bring your teenage daughter, come spend 2 weeks with me in Asia. They'll learn more just hanging around Asia than they will sitting in the school system in wherever, in Tempe, Arizona. And you could say, okay, well, I'm going to send my kids to international schools, or I'm going to move to another country, but I want to send my kids to international schools. If we already agree that the school system where you live could be better, your kids could learn more by seeing what's happening in the world. We've interviewed Jim Rogers a number of times. You know, his kids have benefited greatly from living in Asia. Well, here's the extra piece of the puzzle for how the nomad capitalist can do that. It's an article from CNBC talking about what I've been telling you for years. Traveling teachers work with families who travel the world. Now, this article is more focused on here's what it pays, as in here's an opportunity. But what I've told you for years is hire a tutor. Now, you're going to see in this article, they're talking about tutors from, let's say, the United States. If you're already American, why would you hire a tutor from the United States? Number one, I mean, maybe it costs more. I don't think that's the issue when it comes to hiring a tutor for your kids, but they're not necessarily bringing a different perspective. Why not hire a tutor? And maybe you hire one for the entirety of the kid's life. Maybe you hire one every year. Maybe you hire one every couple of years to go through kind of the different phases of early elementary school, middle elementary school. You know, maybe there's different tutors for different levels. There's many different ways you could do it. But what if you hired a tutor from some other part of the world that perhaps was able to teach your child a language? Kids up to a certain age just soak up languages like a sponge. Wouldn't it be nice if your child spoke another language? And wouldn't it be pretty easy if you found someone? Now, depending on where you're living, if you're living around the world, I talk about my trifecta model, where you spend, if you're doing it kind of very exact, it's 4 months in 3 different places. That could be a very tax-friendly place to live, depending on which countries that you choose to live in, and depending on where you're from, and depending on other factors. That's what we help our clients figure out. But living in 3 different countries, 4 months a year can be good. And then you're exposing your kids to the lifestyle of different places, and they can find friends in each of those places. I have adults who move around the world to, for example, work with Nomad Capitalist. Just had somebody, move about 3 weeks ago. Already made 3 friends as an adult. Adults are supposed to have a harder time making friends than kids. So what if you had, kids who had friends and you spent time in different parts of the world? You could have that tutor travel with you. Now, obviously, there's immigration questions about how to, how that tutor can follow you. There's certain countries that will give your tutor or a domestic helper a visa, like Malaysia, I believe, still does that. Other countries might let them live there as a tourist for certain periods of time. So there's all kinds of different stuff to think about. But if you were to live in those different 3 different places, let's say you lived in South America for 4 months a year, that's not a bad residence permit to have as a backup plan. It is a much more sparsely populated part of the world. It's away from a lot of the world's danger zones and wars and the craziness that's going on. There are certainly some economic opportunities down there. And if your child or children spent 4 months a year in Latin America and they could learn Spanish, that would be not a bad thing to have if your kids don't already speak Spanish. And certainly better than when we learned Spanish in middle and high school. I think that they would certainly come out of that better. And so perhaps, if you're going to spend a certain amount enough time in a country that speaks Spanish, where they're just going to pick it up when they're talking to their friends and just around town, maybe you don't want to hire a Spanish-speaking tutor. Maybe you want to hire a tutor to teach them. Jim Rogers wanted his girls to learn Chinese. Maybe you want your kids to learn Chinese. Maybe you think that, the UAE and the Gulf is going to be the future. You want them to learn Arabic. Hire an Arabic-speaking tutor. And so you can kind of mix and match the living in different places. I'm not saying you have to live in 3 different places. That's not the only school of thought. We had one guy, he said, I want to live in 6 different places, 2 months each. Seemed a little extreme for me. I have homes in 7 different places now. I don't spend a lot of time in most of them, but they're there. It's good to pop in every once in a while for business. But you can decide how many places you want to have. Maybe you just want a couple living in your own country and doing homeschooling and hiring a tutor for that. With, you go and spend 3 months somewhere else. And maybe that 3 months that you spend in some other country gets a second passport going for you. And that's all you need to do is spend 3 months in that country every year. And the second passport comes in 5 months. So, we talk about lowering your taxes. We talk about getting second residences and passports. You can kind of merge that in. It's very holistic. And this is kind of the planning we do for our clients, where everything has to be kind of considered in a holistic perspective. I think that Nomad Capitalist does that in a way no one else does. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply and learn more about how we do it. But you can just kind of see the thought process here. If you have children, how many places do you want to live? Is one of those places the country you live in now? If you're allowed to do homeschooling there, maybe you do that. Maybe you hire a tutor to help you. Pretty hard to get most people into the United States is the problem if you're an American. So that's where hiring the American tutor would work, because most people are going to have a hard time getting some kind of permission to live and really to work in the United States. That's tough. But you can figure out where you want to live, how often you want to live, what languages they speak there, how important languages are. All that should be considered for what we're talking about here. Here's the story. Lucy Alexandra Spencer spent 16 weeks abroad last year in Oman, France, Switzerland, and Portugal. Unlike with most people, traveling is how she earns rather than spends money. This is from CNBC.com, and CNBC.com hasn't realized that a lot of nomad capitalists either run businesses that are in the cloud, run businesses in their home country, but they're not the ones necessarily running it day to day, or they're just calling the shots remotely, or they're investors. They trade stocks. They have Bitcoin investments, what have you. So obviously plenty of opportunities to be traveling the world, as it were. I don't know that I perceive myself as a person who travels the world. I travel a lot, but much of my time these days is spent in my own homes. I just go where I want to be, what suits my lifestyle at the moment. If I want to learn about opportunities in South America, if something's on my mind, I go down and I stay in Bogota. Maybe I take a flight to some nearby place and I talk to people about opportunities. So you can obviously be making money while you're living out of the country. But CNBC says that this woman's basically teaching people. Her trips are paid for by her employers. They're wealthy Europeans and Americans who hire her to travel with their families for weeks and occasionally months at a time. Spencer is a former primary school teacher with experience teaching students with learning difficulties. She embarked on her first traveling teaching role 7 years ago. Since then, she spent about 2 years abroad, including an 8-month trip to Europe, the US, and the Middle East, she said. The cost to hire a teacher like the UK-based Spencer is comparable with a private school fees for multiple children, about £8,000. That's about $10,000 a month to work with 3 children. Families, of course, also pay the cost of her flights, accommodations, and meals. And so what she's doing is coming in, it seems like in a more surgical way. Hey, you're going to be on a 2-month trip. I'll come and I'll be with you then. I would say, why not hire someone who could just always be with you? And again, are we going to do it where it's like, okay, we have Mrs. Johnson as the kindergarten teacher, and then the first grade is, Miss Smith? Or are we going to do it where, hey, do a 3-year contract? And, because, we only have a couple of kids, maybe they're a little bit different ages. Like, you could figure that out. I'm not the homeschooling expert, but I understand, indeed, $10,000 a month that is pretty comparable to private school tutoring. And here's the thing. I had a friend of mine, his kids are all grown now, I think, but he was living in New York at one point. He ended up leaving and had a much more tax-friendly life somewhere else. But when he was in New York, it cost about $150,000 to send his 3 kids to some top school. And I said, you had to earn over $300,000 by the time every tax authority got their claws into you. You had to earn over $300,000. You're already in the top couple percent, I guess, in New York City just to send your kids to school. You haven't eaten, you haven't put a roof over your head, $300,000. Even if you're an American, you may not be able to reduce your taxes to 0 by moving overseas. Some Americans can. But you can certainly reduce them probably to somewhere in the single digits, maybe the low double digits. Even if you're not living in New York City, even if you're living somewhere else where your taxes are 35 or 40% all in, when you figure out every tax you're paying, if you can cut your taxes by 70%, you can probably also cut your cost of living, depending on where you want to go. If you want to go to Ireland, for example, they've got a tax-friendly system and they speak English, and that might be a soft landing for some families, but you're not going to cut your costs. But if you want to go to the places that we talk about, Kuala Lumpur, where our annual event is hosted this year, Nomad Capitalist Live, you're going to cut your cost by probably 2/3 there. So if you cut your taxes by 75%, if you cut your cost of living by some percent, that $10,000 a month pretty much pays for itself. Your kids are getting the opportunity to live in these places. Now, the one thing they don't mention is I'm really unclear on like there are some immigration issues here. If you're going to go and spend time, particularly in more developed countries, you can't just have someone coming along and basically working without a work visa. Some countries explicitly don't care. Other countries perhaps just don't enforce it. The higher you go in terms of developed countries, they're probably going to care. And so there's some immigration planning that I would think about. And if you wanted to help her do her tax planning as well, she's UK based. If she's never living in the UK, why is she paying UK taxes? Potentially you could pay her less if she actually gets to keep more of that $10,000 a month. So these are the kinds of things that come to my mind. But if you're paying for private school, or if you grew up in a place where I grew up in Ohio in the United States, and property taxes in Ohio, where we lived, were much higher than other parts of the country, at least at the time, because it went to pay for the schools. And so, I mean, if you were to sell your property, I think back in the 1990s, we were paying, I don't know, it's close to $10,000. I have friends from Long Island in New York. I mean, their friends own houses, $30,000, $40,000 a year in property taxes. That money goes to the schools. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to make this actually cost neutral and actually a cost savings exercise. And so the only thing I don't like about this article or about this situation is I would just think that you'd want to hire someone and keep them around long term. And so 3 kids, $10,000 a month. I'm guessing, there's probably some immigration plan. Now you get a feeder, and then it comes to, hey, is there a real estate investment opportunity? Could I buy, 1 bedrooms in the 3 places that I'm going to be? And she'll live there. So there's lots of tax and immigration and kind of logistical issues. This is what I spend my time thinking about, like my entire life, is this is what I geek out on, is how to make this stuff work. But here it is. People are hiring women like this, and maybe men too, to go around. What they say here, though, it's an educator, not a tutor. And it's not about someone who's just coming in and kind of helping add on to the existing training. This is someone who is basically the educator. And so I'm sure that there are certain standards, depending on where you're from, that might apply. There are certain criteria. I've had the thought that as long as you can meet the criteria for your kids to get into high school, or whatever you'd call high school where you live, perhaps at some point they want to go to a private high school. Maybe that facilitates getting into university more easily. Maybe that facilitates more socialization at that, kind of tender teenage years. So there's many different ways you could play this, but I think you could build a curricula, with someone like this that suits whatever your needs are. So you have the tutor travels with you. Again, whether you're in 1 country, 2 countries, 3 countries, whether you're constantly on the go. Meanwhile, your children learn about all these other places. The tutor can add, again, I mean, if she's from the UK, she's not really adding a language you may not already speak potentially, but find someone who's not from the UK. Theoretically, by the way, I mean, you could live in many different parts of Europe, and Europe extends beyond the borders of what you think are Europe. I mean, there's parts of the Caribbean that are in Europe. If you have a European passport, you ostensibly could handle everyone's immigration issues all at once and just live within different parts of Europe. That's not as diversified perhaps as I would like, but that could work for you. I mean, follow the sun. I have a friend who lives living in the Canary Islands. There could be tax benefits there. And so maybe you spend part of your time in the Canary Islands. Then maybe, you go somewhere else, then you go somewhere. I mean, there's just so many different permutations of how you could do this. But the bottom line is this is a trend that's taking off. I've met some very wealthy people in the last year or two who are doing this. Some of them have the tutor. Some of them are actually just doing the homeschooling themselves. I think that it seems like the people who have like one child are more likely to be more involved themselves. If they have like 3 children, like in this story, they're more likely to have the tutor who's actually helping. And that person kind of becomes part of the family. So, not atypical, by the way, in places like Latin America, where someone might have a nanny for their entire childhood or a housekeeper for their entire childhood who lives in the nanny's part of the house. And I mean, they're 25 years old and they still have the nanny, like part of the family, perfectly well-adjusted people. And so I think if the thing holding you back is where are my kids going to go to school, the reality is a lot of the places children are going to school these days could get a leveling up. And so if you could build a high quality curricula that includes other languages, takes out any of the stuff that maybe you personally object to, or adds certain things that your kids aren't getting in school that you'd like them to know, I think your kids are going to be much more successful in life, have a much more broad worldview, and perhaps you can save a lot of money in taxes, pick up an extra passport, diversify yourself, make a good real estate investment, find the next business opportunity as you're in other parts of the world, something that we've done, working with more folks. We don't just work with Americans, we have folks from all over the world who call on us for our help. And so if you want to learn about how we can help you, as you can see, there's a lot of questions involved. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. A lot of people would like to offer the service that we do. I've spent well over a decade putting this all together. We've built, I think, the world's strongest back end of knowledge about all this kind of stuff, immigration and taxes. I mean, from doing it and helping people and having a network with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vendors around the world and professionals, but just stuff that we've researched and we've tested. Most people can sell you a passport. Most people can help you with taxes in one country. We like to help you with the entire picture, even down to if you're going to hire a tutor, what are the immigration consequences if that person spends 3 months a year in Colombia? There's a lot of stuff that people aren't thinking about, but I think this is a step in the right direction.